This Russian female prison is so terrifying that even the most hardened convicts would go to any length, including inflicting fatal harm on themselves, just to avoid being sent there. Then, about 3,000 miles away in Uzbekistan, pregnant inmates are forced to terminate their pregnancies so it doesn't affect their ability to work. Life in these prisons is nothing short of a real-life horror film, and the female prisoners are basically living in hell. In this video, we have compiled a list of the worst places a female prisoner could find herself. Number 17. HMP Bronzefield. Despite being one of the largest female prisons in Europe, Bronzefield is by far one of the most understaffed, and it does not stop there. The very few staff on duty just do not care at all. In 2016, Natasha Chin arrived at Bronzefield suffering from a serious medical condition that left her vomiting repeatedly for hours. Fellow inmates reportedly begged officers to get medical assistance as her condition deteriorated. Instead, those pleas were ignored. After nearly 9 hours without proper treatment, Natasha died inside her cell. An investigation later concluded that opportunities to save her life had been missed, raising uncomfortable questions about the prison's emergency healthcare procedures. That won't be the last time such a tragedy happens. Bronzefield would later come under intense scrutiny after another emergency unfolded behind a locked cell door. 18-year-old Rihanna Clear went into labor completely alone. For more than 12 agonizing hours, she cried out for help, yet no one came. By the time staff finally entered her cell, she had already delivered her baby by herself. Desperate, she had even bitten through the umbilical cord because there was nobody else to do it. Her newborn son, Ishak, died shortly afterwards. The incident sparked national outrage across the United Kingdom. Independent investigations criticized serious failures in emergency response, healthcare monitoring, and staff communication, exposing systemic problems that stretched far beyond a single mistake. Suddenly, Bronzefield wasn't being discussed for the criminals it housed, but for the institution itself. And as horrifying as that sounds, at the next prison, officers turned abuse into a currency. Number 16. Lowell Correctional Institution. There was one thing more valuable than money inside Lowell Correctional Institution: access. A pack of cigarettes worth only a few dollars on the outside could suddenly become worth hundreds behind bars.
For a pack of cigarettes cost me $3, and then we're in the dorm laughing at him. Oh, all I had to do was 2 minutes. I got $400.
But many women weren't paying with cash. They were paying with their dignity. As the largest women's prison in the United States, Lowell was supposed to rehabilitate thousands of inmates serving sentences for crimes ranging from drug offenses to murder. Instead, it became infamous for something far more disturbing. Numerous investigations and lawsuits painted a picture of a prison where some correctional officers allegedly abused the enormous power they held over vulnerable women. Former inmate Ginger Oman described an environment where exploitation became part of the prison economy. According to her account, officers exchanged contraband, including cigarettes and other privileges, acts. What made the allegations even more disturbing was what happened afterwards. She claimed some officers would openly joke about these encounters with colleagues, treating the women involved as little more than entertainment. For inmates who refused to cooperate or dared report the abuse, life often became even harder. Women described being threatened with disciplinary reports, placed in isolation, denied hygiene products, and in some cases deprived of food. Speaking out wasn't simply discouraged, it carried consequences. One of the most shocking incidents involved Cheryl Weimar, a 52-year-old inmate whose encounter with officers left her permanently paralyzed from the neck down. According to reports, she suffered catastrophic spinal injuries during an altercation with correctional staff. The case attracted national attention and reignited criticism over excessive force and accountability inside the institution. Lowell's reputation continued to unravel as federal investigations uncovered repeated allegations of staff misconduct, sexual abuse, and failures in oversight. Corrupt guards make a prison dangerous, but a total collapse makes it lethal for everyone inside. Number 15. Gitarama Prison. There are prisons where inmates fear the guards and others where inmates fear each other. Then there was Gitarama Prison, where prisoners eventually feared starvation more than anything else. Built in Rwanda to hold around 400 inmates, Gitarama became a symbol of everything that can happen when a prison system completely collapses. In the aftermath of the 1994 Rwandan genocide, tens of thousands of suspects were arrested as the country struggled to investigate one of history's darkest chapters. Many were sent to Gitarama. Instead of 400 inmates, it eventually held more than 7,000. Every available space disappeared beneath human bodies. Prisoners stood pressed against one another for hours because there was no room to sit. At night, many remained standing as they tried to sleep, using those around them to keep themselves from falling over. With so many people confined in such a small space, food ran dangerously short, clean water became increasingly scarce, and disease spread with terrifying speed. Dysentery, cholera, and other infections moved rapidly through the prison population, while medical care remained almost non-existent. The crowd around them often trampled those who became too weak to stand, their bodies remaining on the floor until guards could eventually remove them. Which is why, when this horrifying allegation came out, it was not unbelievable. Former inmates and investigators reported that extreme starvation had become so severe that isolated incidents of cannibalism occurred inside the prison. Human Rights Watch and other observers documented claims that desperate prisoners consumed the flesh of inmates who had died. Gitarama starved bodies to breaking point, but the next prison was built to starve the mind instead. Number 14. Heilongjiang Women's Prison. This northeastern China prison has long been accused of serving a very different purpose. Human rights organizations and former detainees have repeatedly alleged that the facility functions as a place where women imprisoned for their religious or political beliefs are subjected to relentless pressure until they abandon their convictions. For many of them, the sentence was measured by how much suffering they could endure before finally breaking. One of those women was Li Jinping, a Falun Gong practitioner arrested simply because she refused to renounce her faith. According to survivor testimonies, prison officials subjected her to repeated beatings before forcing her to remain seated on a tiny wooden stool for hours without moving. What sounds like a minor punishment quickly became torture. The constant pressure cut into her skin, leaving painful sores that refused to heal. When Li protested by refusing food, guards reportedly answered with force feeding rather than medical care. Former inmates described being pinned down while tubes were pushed through their noses, a procedure that, when performed violently, could become agonizing and even life-threatening. The suffering didn't stop there. Another former prisoner recounted spending nearly 2 months confined inside a tiny isolation cell, chained to a metal ring fixed into the concrete floor. She later claimed she remained handcuffed behind her back for more than a year, suspended for long periods, and forced to stand outdoors in freezing temperatures before being beaten again if she failed to comply with orders. Women also reported being watched constantly, even while using the toilet. Basic bodily functions became privileges controlled by guards, with strict schedules determining when inmates could relieve themselves. Just like in the next prison, by the time many women finally left Heilongjiang, they weren't just physically scarred. They had spent years fighting to hold on to the one thing the prison seemed determined to take away: their identity. Number 13. Evin Prison. Thousands of Iranian women who find themselves in Evin Prison got there by simply talking. Built in 1972 on the outskirts of Tehran, the prison gradually became the most infamous detention facility in Iran. Over the decades, its name became synonymous with political imprisonment and forced confessions. For generations of Iranians, hearing that someone had been taken to Evin was often enough to make families fear the worst. Former prisoners have described interrogations lasting for hours, sometimes continuing late into the night until exhaustion blurred the line between truth and survival. Many women reported spending weeks or even months in solitary confinement inside cells so small and silent that they eventually lost track of time. Without clocks, windows, or meaningful human contact, some said they began talking to themselves simply to hear another voice. How about the way medical care was handled? Human rights organizations have repeatedly documented cases in which prisoners suffering from serious illnesses were allegedly denied timely treatment, particularly when authorities believed withholding care could be used to force cooperation. Following the Woman Life Freedom protests in 2022, Evin once again became the center of international attention as hundreds of women were reportedly detained during the nationwide crackdown. Among them were journalists, students, artists, and activists, whose arrests drew condemnation from governments and human rights organizations around the world. Then, in October 2022, disaster struck inside the prison itself. A fire broke out in one section of Evin, sending thick smoke into the night sky as gunshots and explosions were heard from within the compound. The chaos left multiple prisoners dead and dozens injured. Families gathered outside the prison, desperate for answers, while conflicting official statements only deepened fears about what had really happened behind the walls. However, it's hard to tell which is more barbaric, this or a prison that has a thing for brutalizing pregnant women. Number 12. Parapana Agrahara Central Prison. On September 4, 2024, disturbing accounts once again emerged from Bengaluru's Parapana Agrahara Central Prison, drawing renewed attention to the treatment of pregnant inmates inside one of India's most overcrowded correctional facilities. The reports described women sleeping on thin bedding spread across concrete floors, receiving inconsistent prenatal care, and preparing to give birth in an environment never designed to care for mothers or newborns. Parapana Agrahara was originally constructed to house male offenders. As the female prison population grew, women were moved into facilities that lacked many of the resources their needs demanded. The result was an institution where pregnancy often became another hardship to survive rather than a condition requiring specialized care. Former inmates have described spending months sharing cramped dormitories where privacy barely existed. Clean drinking water, sanitation, and proper nutrition were stretched thin by overcrowding, while expectant mothers constantly worried about what would happen if labor began unexpectedly. Every day carried the same uncertainty. If complications arose, would medical staff reach them in time? Health experts have long warned that prolonged stress, poor nutrition, and inadequate prenatal monitoring significantly increase the risk of premature birth and miscarriage. Inside Parapana Agrahara, those risk factors existed simultaneously. Neglect wore women down slowly here, but at the next prison, fear made inmates injure themselves before even arriving. Karnataka. Rampant corruption, negligence, and mismanagement exposed in Parapana Agrahara Central Jail scandal. Number 11. IK-14 Prison. Located in Russia's Mordovia region, this prison had earned a reputation that spread long before new inmates ever reached its gates. Stories traveled through the prison system about impossible work quotas, brutal punishments, and women pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Whether every rumor was true hardly mattered. By the time the transport vehicle arrived, many prisoners were already terrified. In fact, former inmates recalled prisoners deliberately slitting their wrists, swallowing nails, and inflicting other serious injuries after learning they were being transferred to the penal colony. The hope wasn't to escape prison altogether. It was simply to be declared medically unfit for transport. In their minds, almost anywhere was better than IK-14. In 2013, one inmate ensured the outside world would hear those stories as well. Her name was Nadezhda Tolokonikova, a member of the Russian protest group Pussy Riot. In an open letter smuggled out of the prison, she described a system built around relentless labor. According to her account, women routinely worked 16 to 17 hours a day at sewing machines, producing military uniforms and other garments under punishing production quotas.
Why it is bad to make women work for 16 hours a day without day off.
Officially, they were entitled to rest. In reality, she alleged that days off could disappear for weeks if targets weren't met. Women who couldn't keep pace reportedly faced verbal abuse, humiliation, and punishment. Former prisoners alleged they were forced to stand outside in freezing temperatures, denied necessities, or placed in solitary confinement. Others claimed inmate supervisors, acting with the approval of prison authorities, physically assaulted women who slowed production or questioned orders. The work itself became another form of punishment. Hour after hour, women sat bent over sewing machines until their backs ached, their fingers bled, and exhaustion blurred into routine. Sleep became a luxury. Illness became an inconvenience. Productivity became the only measure that seemed to matter. Tolokonikova's letter sparked international condemnation and renewed scrutiny of Russia's penal system. But for the women still inside IK-14, very little changed. The hard labor continued, and another group of prisoners arrived already knowing why so many women had tried so desperately never to reach the prison in the first place. And in some places, even the people meant to enforce order were entirely given over to riots and corruption. Number 10. La Mesa Prison. On September 16, 2008, thick columns of smoke rose above La Mesa Prison in Tijuana, Mexico, as panic swept through one of the most overcrowded prisons in Latin America. Inmates scattered in every direction while heavily armed security forces rushed through the gates, trying to contain yet another riot. By the time the violence was over, more than 20 prisoners were dead, dozens more were injured, and La Mesa's reputation had become even more infamous. But for many observers, the riot was unavoidable. La Mesa had been built to accommodate around 2,000 inmates, but by the early 2010s, more than 7,000 people were crammed behind its walls. Cells meant for a handful of prisoners held several times that number, while hallways, stairwells, and common areas became makeshift sleeping quarters. Every inch of space was contested, and every day pushed the prison closer to breaking point. But overcrowding alone didn't turn La Mesa into a powder keg. Corruption had quietly transformed life inside the prison into a system where almost everything could be bought. Prisoners with enough money reportedly paid for larger living spaces, better food, access to contraband, and treatment far removed from the reality facing ordinary inmates. The disparity became so outrageous that in 2002, authorities demolished an illegal luxury condominium built entirely inside the prison. While thousands fought over filthy mattresses and limited food, a privileged few were living in conditions that resembled private apartments. That imbalance created resentment, and resentment often exploded into violence. Inside those walls, surviving your sentence wasn't the hardest challenge. Surviving the prison itself was difficult. But while La Mesa descended into chaos because of corruption and overcrowding, the next prison crumbled under sheer suffocating overcrowding instead. Number 9. El Buen Pastor Women's Prison. On April 28, 2020, families gathered outside El Buen Pastor Women's Prison in Bogotá, desperate for answers. Just weeks earlier, deadly unrest had erupted in prisons across Colombia as inmates protested overcrowding and deteriorating conditions during the COVID-19 pandemic. Although El Buen Pastor avoided the bloodshed seen elsewhere, the crisis pulled back the curtain on a prison that former inmates had spent years describing as overcrowded, violent, and deeply unequal. Behind its walls, survival depended less on the length of your sentence than on where you stood in the prison's unwritten social order. The prison was originally designed to house only a fraction of the women it now accommodates. Cells built for 2 inmates frequently held 10, sometimes even 20. Mattresses covered nearly every inch of the floor, leaving barely enough room to walk. Fresh air was scarce, privacy was non-existent, and the constant lack of personal space turned everyday disagreements into dangerous confrontations. But the overcrowding was only part of the story. Former inmates described a prison governed by invisible rules. Women with money, outside connections, or influence occupied the top of the hierarchy, enjoying privileges unavailable to others. Those at the bottom often became targets of intimidation, extortion, and violence. According to testimonies from former prisoners and their families, drugs circulated throughout the prison despite security measures, while corruption allegedly allowed illicit activities to continue behind locked gates. Some women reported living in constant fear of sexual violence from fellow inmates, knowing there were few places to hide inside packed cell blocks. Others described spending almost the entire day confined to their overcrowded cells, with little opportunity to exercise or even breathe fresh air. At the next camp, the state itself worked women to death. Number 8. Kachon Concentration Camp. By August 2022, around 40 of the roughly 500 women serving life sentences inside North Korea's Kachon concentration camp had died in just over 2 years, according to testimony collected from former detainees and reporting on conditions inside the country's prison camp system. They weren't killed during a riot or due to an outbreak of disease. They simply didn't survive the camp. Officially known as Kyohwaso No. 1, Kaichon is presented by North Korean authorities as a place of re-education through labor. Former prisoners describe something very different. Every morning began before sunrise. Women were marched to factories producing shoes, clothing, leather goods, and rubber products, where they spent up to 18 hours working under relentless supervision. Production quotas were treated as absolute, and falling behind was considered disobedience. Those who failed to meet their targets were often forced to continue working long after everyone else had stopped, despite exhaustion, illness, or injury. The punishment didn't end when the workday was over. Former inmates described sleeping in filthy rooms where as many as 90 women were squeezed into spaces barely large enough for a fraction of that number. Fleas and lice spread freely through the overcrowded barracks, while access to toilets remained severely limited. Food consisted of tiny portions of corn or cabbage soup, leaving many prisoners permanently hungry. Some survivors recalled watching inmates catch rats simply to have something extra to eat. And even without collapse, daily life inside can still become just as suffocating. Number 7. HMP Style. On December 17, 2020, prison officers at HMP Style unlocked the door to an 18-year-old inmate's cell and found her dead. Her name was Anaya Sanderson. Only weeks earlier, she had been arrested for stealing a pair of shoes and assaulting shop workers who tried to stop her. According to evidence later presented during an inquest, the teenager had poured gasoline over herself and even attempted to drink it on the day of her arrest, clear signs that she was experiencing a severe mental health crisis. But instead of receiving the psychiatric intervention she desperately needed, she was remanded to one of England's largest women's prisons. Her death reignited a debate that had followed HMP Style for years. Located in Cheshire, the prison holds women convicted of offenses ranging from minor crimes to serious violent offenses. But one statistic has repeatedly overshadowed everything else. Since 2007, Style has recorded one of the highest numbers of self-inflicted deaths in the women's prison estate, with 11 inmates taking their own lives over the years. Mental illness has become one of the prison's greatest challenges. Reports have consistently shown that a significant proportion of women arriving at Style suffer from depression, anxiety, substance addiction, or previous trauma. Many have histories of domestic abuse, homelessness, or self-harm long before entering prison. Critics argue that the institution has increasingly become a place that houses vulnerable women without having the resources necessary to care for them properly. For women already struggling with psychological distress, imprisonment frequently deepens an existing crisis rather than treating it. But even when a prison tries to function normally, hidden tensions begin to shape what happens inside. Number 6. Welikata Women's Prison. Nearly 2/3 of the women imprisoned at Welikata were first-time offenders who had been convicted of relatively minor crimes and expected to serve their sentence quietly before returning home. Instead, they entered Sri Lanka's largest women's prison and found themselves living alongside hardened offenders, serving lengthy sentences for violent crimes. Inside Welikata, those differences mattered very little. Once the cell door closed, everyone lived under the same rules. Arguments over food, water, and sleeping space were part of daily life. Trust came at a cost, and showing weakness often invited intimidation. Former inmates described learning very quickly to keep their heads down, avoid unnecessary conversations, and never involve themselves in other people's disputes, because even the smallest disagreement could spiral into violence. As years passed, independent inspections painted an equally troubling picture. The prison was operating far beyond its intended capacity, leaving women packed into overcrowded dormitories where privacy disappeared almost entirely. Heat built up inside the cells, sanitation steadily declined, and pests became a constant part of everyday life. For inmates already struggling with trauma, addiction, or mental illness, the environment often deepened problems that had existed long before prison. In 2023, renewed attention from rights organizations once again highlighted the conditions inside Welikata. But for the women living there, the reports contained very few surprises. They had already experienced them firsthand. But even the oppression in Welikata couldn't match the desperation inside the next prison, where inmates became so terrified of the officers guarding them instead. Number 5. Julia Tutwiler, Prison for Women. No matter how dangerous the inmates in a prison are, the officers are supposed to protect them. But at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, those same officers reportedly oppressed them. Women filed complaints accusing correctional officers of sexual abuse, harassment, and intimidation. Many allegations never went anywhere. Some inmates said they were afraid to report what had happened, fearing retaliation from the very people who controlled where they slept, when they ate, and whether they would spend the next few weeks in solitary confinement. Others believed nobody outside the prison would ever believe them. Then the federal government started asking questions. After conducting an extensive investigation, the United States Department of Justice released a devastating report in 2014. Investigators concluded there was reasonable cause to believe that staff at Tutwiler had subjected female prisoners to a pattern of unconstitutional sexual abuse. The report described allegations of officers coercing inmates into sexual acts, engaging in inappropriate sexual relationships with prisoners, and abusing the extraordinary power they held over women who had almost none. The investigation transformed Tutwiler into a national scandal. Federal authorities demanded sweeping reforms, including improved supervision, better staff training, and stronger safeguards to protect inmates from abuse. Several officers were prosecuted or dismissed, while the prison system came under intense public scrutiny. For many former inmates, however, those changes came too late. The damage had already been done. But institutional abuse isn't the only way a prison can break its inmates. Number 4. Qarchaq Women's Prison. When Iranian human rights activist Narges Mohammadi was told she was being transferred to another prison, supporters immediately raised the alarm. It wasn't because she was being moved to a higher security facility. Rather, because she was being sent to Qarchaq. For years, that single name had carried a terrifying reputation among Iranian prisoners. Human rights organizations repeatedly condemned it, and political prisoners described transfers there not as routine administrative decisions, but as punishment. And once they arrived, many understood why. Unlike most prisons, Qarchaq wasn't originally built to house people. The facility had once been an industrial livestock complex before being converted into a women's prison. But even after the conversion, critics argue the buildings were never properly redesigned for long-term human habitation, leaving generations of inmates to live in conditions they described as degrading and unsafe. Aside from that, there was no segregation in the prison. Women imprisoned for peaceful activism, journalism, or political dissent were routinely housed alongside inmates convicted of violent offenses and serious drug crimes. Former prisoners believed it was designed to intimidate political detainees by surrounding them with unpredictability and constant fear. Conditions inside only deepened that anxiety. In June 2022, reports emerged that raw sewage had flooded parts of the prison during an intense summer heatwave. Wastewater collected around living areas, while prisoners complained of overpowering smells, insects, and worsening hygiene. Human rights groups warned that inmates already struggling to access basic medical care were now facing an entirely new health risk. Qarchaq inmates couldn't afford to be sick because asking for treatment was a battle in itself. Former detainees repeatedly alleged that women suffering from chronic illnesses or injuries were denied timely medical attention. At the same time, those who protested prison conditions risked disciplinary action or transfer to solitary confinement. According to testimonies collected over the years, punishment at Qarchaq wasn't always physical. Sometimes it meant simply being ignored. Because sometimes the entire system is designed so that every inmate experiences the same reality. But even uniformity can hide practices that raise serious questions about what's happening inside. Number 3. Neve Tirza Women's Prison. Israel only has one women's prison, Neve Tirza. That implies that every female offender, whether they committed a crime like forgery or first-degree murder, ended up in the same facility. That reality shaped life inside from the very beginning. Former inmates described entering the prison and quickly realizing that survival depended on understanding an entirely new social order. Women convicted of minor offenses suddenly found themselves navigating conflicts involving hardened criminals with years of prison experience. Learning who to avoid, when to stay silent, and how to keep out of other people's disputes became just as important as following the prison's official rules. Then, in 2017, tensions boiled over. Following unrest inside the prison, Israeli riot police were deployed to restore order. According to inmates and human rights organizations, officers fired tear gas into enclosed sections of the prison before moving in to regain control. Several women reportedly lost consciousness during the operation. Others later alleged they were beaten, while some claimed they were handcuffed to hospital beds so tightly that their wrists became badly swollen. And in the most extreme cases, officers took control of women's bodies during a riot. At the next prison, they took control of motherhood itself. Number 2. Tashkent Women's Prison. Throughout the early 2000s, former inmates, human rights organizations, and international observers accused authorities in Uzbekistan's Tashkent Women's Prison of forcing pregnant prisoners to undergo abortions. According to multiple reports, officials justified the practice by claiming the prison lacked the facilities and resources needed to care for newborn babies. Critics argued it was simply another way of controlling women who had already lost almost every freedom they possessed. One former prisoner recalled watching pregnant inmates disappear into the prison clinic only to return hours later in silence. Others described the emotional toll that followed, with women grieving children they never had the chance to meet. Independent observers were never able to verify every individual account, but the allegations surfaced repeatedly enough to draw international condemnation and place renewed scrutiny on Uzbekistan's prison system. The prison itself had long been criticized for poor sanitation, inadequate healthcare, and harsh living conditions, but those complaints were overshadowed by the accusations surrounding pregnant inmates. Few stories are more powerful than motherhood, and few allegations provoke stronger reactions than preventing it. The controversy became so significant that international human rights organizations repeatedly called on Uzbek authorities to allow independent monitoring of detention facilities and improve transparency surrounding the treatment of female prisoners. Officials consistently rejected or disputed many of the allegations, making outside verification extremely difficult. And yet, even those allegations are eclipsed by the final prison on this list, where survival itself became uncertain. Number 1. Black Dolphin Prison. Hidden near Russia's border with Kazakhstan, Black Dolphin is best known for housing some of the country's most dangerous criminals, including serial killers, terrorists, and cannibals. Although the prison is overwhelmingly male, a small number of women have also passed through its maximum security regime over the years. For them, every day followed a routine designed not simply to maintain order, but to strip away every sense of independence. The moment an inmate left her cell, she was forced into what became known as the bent-over escort position. Guards ordered prisoners to lean forward at the waist, while keeping their hands cuffed behind their backs and their eyes fixed on the floor. 2 officers gripped each prisoner by the arms as they were marched through corridors they were never allowed to see properly. The purpose was simple. If an escape were ever attempted, inmates would never know the prison's layout well enough to succeed. Lights remained on around the clock, making uninterrupted sleep almost impossible. Cells were monitored continuously, conversations were limited, and prisoners were forbidden from sitting or lying on their beds during the day. In 2019, renewed international attention focused on Russia's prison system after human rights organizations once again criticized conditions in several maximum security facilities, including Black Dolphin's strict regime. Former inmates and prison experts argued that decades of extreme isolation and rigid control inflicted psychological damage that often lasted long after imprisonment. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.